Emily Carter had no idea that today would be the day everything changed. She woke up at 4 a.m. just before dawn to get ready for her shift at the 24/7 coffee shop. From the moment the sun barely peeked over the horizon, she was on her feet, moving non-stop, serving customers, making coffee, cleaning tables. It was all part of the grind. But today something felt different. There was a strange tension in the air, as if something unexpected was about to unfold. What would you do if you suddenly lost everything and had no one left by your side? This question lingered in her mind as she worked tirelessly, trying to get through another double shift. All Emily wanted was to make enough money to care for her sick mother, who was battling an illness that drained not only her body, but their entire savings. Emily barely had time to think about her own well-being. Her focus was entirely on keeping the job and making sure her mother could get the medical treatment she needed. As the clock ticked closer to the end of her shift, a figure entered the coffee shop. It wasn't an unusual occurrence. Customers came and went throughout the day, but this man, with his quiet demeanor, seemed to bring an odd energy with him. He walked in wearing a simple black jacket and jeans, his features calm yet intense. Emily didn't recognize him at first. He blended into the background, as many people did when they came in for their morning caffeine fix. But there was something about him that caught her attention. He sat by the window, staring out as if lost in thought. She couldn't shake the feeling that he wasn't just another customer. There was something different about the way he was observing her. "Hi, how can I help you?" Emily asked with a tired smile, trying to mask the exhaustion in her voice. The man looked up, locking eyes with her. There was a gentle, almost knowing smile on his face. "I'll have a black coffee, please, and you?" he asked, his voice calm but with a touch of curiosity. Emily raised an eyebrow, confused by his casual question. "Just a coffee?" she asked, as if expecting something more elaborate. She had seen customers order the strangest combinations, but this man didn't seem like the usual crowd. "Yeah, just coffee." "Is it always this busy here?" he asked, looking around at the half-filled tables, as if trying to gauge the atmosphere. Of the place, Emily nodded. "Yeah, pretty much non-stop." The man smiled again, though it was softer this time, more like an acknowledgement of her struggle. Emily couldn't quite place it, but there was a familiarity in his gaze, a sense that he wasn't just another passerby. He seemed to be watching her. She quickly shook the thought from her mind. After all, he was just a regular customer. Right? But little did Emily know the man sitting at that table wasn't just anyone. He was Keanu Reeves. Keanu had come into the coffee shop that day for a simple cup of coffee, but what he saw in Emily made him pause. Her exhaustion, her quiet resilience, it resonated with him in a way that he couldn't ignore. And so, without her knowing, he made a decision that would alter the course of her life. He was going to follow her after her shift ended. For Keanu, this wasn't just about a random act of curiosity. There was something about Emily's silent struggle that spoke to him deeply. He had to know more. As Emily finished her shift and began to walk out into the cold night, Keanu stood up, slipped out of the shop behind her, and followed from a distance. Little did Emily know someone was watching her, someone who would soon witness her strength and vulnerability in a way that would leave him, and eventually everyone, in tears. Emily Carter's life was a blur of early mornings, late nights, and an endless cycle of exhaustion. She had never known anything different. From the time she could remember, she was taught to work hard and make ends meet. Born into a small family, Emily had always been the strong one, the one who held things together. But after her mother's diagnosis, that strength was tested more than ever. At 26, Emily was already far too familiar with the weight of responsibility. After dropping out of college to take care of her ailing mother, she found herself stuck in a never-ending loop of working 2 jobs just to pay the bills. Her days were spent serving coffee, cleaning floors, and keeping customers happy, while her nights were often filled with worry, staring at medical bills and hoping there was enough money left for her next shift. She had always been quiet, focused and determined, but the tiredness in her eyes told a different story. Her friends from high school often said she was the girl who could handle anything, that nothing ever seemed to faze her. But the truth was, Emily had learned to hide her struggles behind a mask of professionalism. No one knew the full extent of what she was going through, and that was the way she liked it. If she didn't show weakness, no one could use it against her. Tonight, as she clocked out from her second shift at the coffee shop, Emily felt the familiar ache of exhaustion creeping in. It wasn't just physical fatigue, it was mental and emotional too. Her mother's condition had worsened recently, and despite all her efforts, she couldn't find a way to fix it. Every time Emily looked at her mother, she saw the toll the illness was taking, not just on her body, but on their entire lives. As Emily stepped out into the cool evening air, she took a deep breath, trying to clear her mind of the relentless worries. The street was quiet for the most part, with only a few people walking hurriedly toward their destinations. The noise from the coffee shop faded as she made her way down the street, the sounds of her boots tapping rhythmically on the pavement. The only company she had learned to enjoy the solitude, though sometimes it felt like a burden. Tonight, as she walked toward the bus stop, Emily's thoughts drifted back to her mother, wondering if she was okay at home. Was she resting? Had she taken her medicine? These questions never seemed to stop. What Emily didn't know was that someone was following her, someone who had been quietly observing her every move since she'd finished her shift. Keanu Reeves, the man who had sat in the coffee shop earlier, had quietly slipped out behind her, a few steps back, but never too far. He wasn't sure why he felt compelled to follow her, but something about Emily's presence made him feel like he had to know more. It wasn't just her exhaustion or the quiet strength she wore. It was the sadness he could see lurking behind her eyes. It reminded him of something from his own life. As Emily continued her walk, Keanu kept a careful distance, making sure not to intrude on her space. He had no idea what he was doing, really. He wasn't used to following people, let alone someone he had only met briefly. But something about her struggle felt real, too real to ignore. The bus stop was just a few blocks away, and Emily was lost in her thoughts, unaware of the quiet observer trailing behind her. She stopped at the bus shelter, checking the time on her phone. The bus was still 10 minutes away. It was just another quiet night, another moment in a life that seemed to stretch on endlessly. Keanu stood a few paces behind her, watching as she pulled her jacket tighter around her to ward off the chill. He wanted to go up to her, to ask if she was okay or offer some kind of help, but the thought of intruding, of being too forward, held him back. He wasn't even sure how to start a conversation with someone whose life seemed so heavy with burden. Instead, he stood there, silently, observing her, wondering what he could do, if anything, to make a difference. The following days at the coffee shop felt like a blur to Emily. Her double shifts had become a routine. Wake up early, serve coffee, clean, repeat. The fatigue weighed down on her body, but it was the worry for her mother that weighed heaviest on her mind. Every time she looked at her phone, there were messages from her mom asking if she was coming home soon. Every evening after finishing her shifts, Emily would rush home, trying to balance taking care of her mom and squeezing in whatever sleep she could. The cycle never seemed to end. But this time, something felt different. Every time Emily went to work, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. At first, she chalked it up to her own exhaustion playing tricks on her mind. But when she stepped out of the coffee shop at the end of her shift, there he was, again. The same man who had ordered coffee on the first day, Keanu. She didn't recognize him at first, but the way he moved, almost like he was following her without seeming to mean it, made her uneasy. He wasn't far behind her, but he never came too close either. He seemed to appear at the same time, always a few steps behind. Every time she turned a corner, he was there, as if his presence was a constant shadow. It was odd, unsettling, and yet she couldn't bring herself to confront him. The strange part was that Keanu never seemed to approach her. He never spoke to her again, never tried to make any overt gesture, but Emily couldn't shake the sense that he was observing her, watching her every move as if waiting for something to happen. One night, Emily found herself growing frustrated. She couldn't ignore it anymore. After a long shift, she walked faster, glancing over her shoulder every few seconds. She spotted Keanu following from a distance, his figure always just far enough away to remain inconspicuous. Why is he following me, she thought, trying to convince herself that it was nothing, just a coincidence, a fluke. But the nagging feeling wouldn't leave her. He was always there, always watching. When she finally reached the bus stop, she stood there, her back to the cold glass, the streetlights flickering overhead. She tried to focus on her phone, but the quiet tension made her uneasy. What did he want? Why didn't he just approach her like any normal person? She tried to brush the thoughts aside, but they kept circling in her mind, building up like a knot in her stomach. A part of her was curious. Who was this man? What did he see in her that made him so interested? But the other part, perhaps the more practical side, was wary. She didn't need any distractions, especially not from someone she didn't know. Then, just as she turned her attention back to the street, she noticed Keanu standing a little further down the road, near the corner of the block. He was still, a few feet away, not in her immediate line of sight, but visible enough to catch her eye. She could feel his gaze on her, even though she couldn't see his expression. There was a strange comfort in that. Not in the fact that he was following her, but in the fact that he didn't seem to mean her harm. His presence was almost protective. She shook her head, telling herself she was overthinking things. Her bus arrived, and she quickly stepped inside, relieved to be away from the lingering tension on the street. She sat by the window, looking out at the passing lights, trying to calm herself. As the bus pulled away, she glanced at the corner one last time. Keanu was still there, standing in the shadows, watching her as the bus slowly turned the corner. But what Emily didn't know was that Keanu was no longer just a stranger following her from afar. He had seen something in her that spoke to him, something that reminded him of his own struggles in the past. He wasn't just following her to be curious, he wanted to know the truth. What was it that made her keep going despite the weight of the world on her shoulders? And perhaps more importantly, could he help her? The days that followed were some of the most grueling Emily had ever experienced. Her mother's condition seemed to worsen each day, and the bills piled up, leaving her with little room to breathe. Emily barely slept, barely ate. Her entire existence had narrowed to the small world of the coffee shop and the small apartment she shared with her mom. She couldn't afford to think about anything else. But then there was Keanu. Each day he seemed to be there, never too close but never far enough for her to forget he was there. She caught glimpses of him following her again, just like the night at the bus stop. But she didn't know what to make of it. Was he concerned, or was it something else? It was hard to tell, but something in the back of her mind made her uneasy. On the fourth day, Emily's world shifted. It had been a particularly long shift at the coffee shop, and by the time she stepped outside, the night was colder than usual. The wind cut through her jacket, but she didn't mind. She was used to it. She was used to everything, the exhaustion, the worry, the loneliness. But tonight, she was not prepared for what happened next. As she stepped off the curb and walked toward the bus stop, she noticed something strange. The same man, Keanu, was standing across the street watching her. His figure was framed by the dim glow of the streetlights, and for the first time, she saw his face clearly. He wasn't just watching from afar anymore. He was waiting for something, waiting for her. Her pulse quickened. Emily stood frozen in place, trying to make sense of the situation. She felt the familiar anxiety rise in her chest, but this time, it was different. Something about the look in Keanu's eyes made her feel uneasy, and yet oddly she didn't want to leave. She had the strange feeling that she was on the verge of discovering something she needed to know, something that might change everything. Keanu crossed the street slowly, his gaze never leaving hers. Emily's heart raced. She tried to tell herself to move, to get on the bus and just go home, but for some reason she couldn't bring herself to do it. He stopped in front of her, standing at a respectful distance. "Hey," Keanu said quietly, his voice gentle but firm. "Are you okay?" It was the first time he had spoken directly to her, and the words hit Emily in a way she wasn't prepared for. The weight of the question seemed to cut through the layers of her carefully constructed facade. It was as if everything she had been holding inside, her struggles, her fears, her exhaustion, came crashing down in an instant. I'm fine," she stammered, blinking back the sudden surge of emotion. She hadn't expected to feel so vulnerable. "I'm just tired." Keanu studied her, his gaze soft but unwavering. "I know what it's like," he said quietly, "to feel like you're carrying the weight of the world alone." Emily swallowed hard. The words seemed to echo in her chest, reverberating with a truth she hadn't fully acknowledged until now. She was carrying everything alone. There was no one to help, no one to lean on. Every decision, every step was up to her, and it was exhausting. "Why have you been following me?" she asked, finally giving voice to the question that had been eating at her for days. Her voice shook, but there was no turning back now. Keanu's expression softened, and for the first time, Emily saw the vulnerability in his eyes. He wasn't just some random stranger following her. There was a depth to him, a sense of understanding. That made her feel strangely seen. "I wasn't following you to make you feel uncomfortable," Keanu explained. "I was just watching. I saw something in you that reminded me of my own struggles. I've been where you are, and I know what it's like to feel like you're just trying to survive, trying to make things work." Emily's chest tightened. As she listened, she couldn't understand why someone like him would care about her life, but something in his voice felt genuine. He wasn't judging her. He wasn't trying to fix her. He was just acknowledging her pain. "Why?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop it. "Why do you care?" Keanu's eyes softened even further. "Because sometimes we all need a little help. Even if it's just someone to listen, you don't have to go through this alone." There was a long pause, and in that silence, Emily felt something inside her shift. It was a shift she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Hope. Maybe she didn't have to carry everything by herself. Maybe, just maybe, someone cared enough to help. And in that moment, Emily realized that this stranger, Keanu, had offered her the one thing she hadn't had in a long time: compassion. Genuine, unselfish compassion. "I don't know what to do," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. I'm just so tired." Keanu took a step closer, offering a reassuring smile. "You don't have to do anything right now. Just know that it's okay to let someone in. It's okay to not have all the answers." Emily's eyes welled up with tears. She had been so strong for so long, and the idea of letting someone else in, letting someone else see the cracks in her carefully crafted armor, terrified her. But in that moment, surrounded by the hum of the city, the cold night air, and the quiet reassurance of Keanu's presence, she realized something. She didn't have to carry everything by herself. The next few days were a blur of emotions for Emily. The weight of the conversation with Keanu lingered in her mind, and for the first time in a long while, she found herself thinking about something other than work or her mother's health. She had allowed herself to be vulnerable, to share the pain she had carried for so long, and in return, she felt a sense of relief that she hadn't known she needed. But life didn't stop. It couldn't. Emily's shifts at the coffee shop were as demanding as ever, and when she wasn't at work, she was at home caring for her mother, who had taken a turn for the worse. Her once lively and independent mom had become frail, her health deteriorating so rapidly that Emily could see the fear in her eyes, the fear of what was coming next. One afternoon, after an especially difficult morning shift, Emily came home to find her mother in a state of distress. Her mother, unable to fully communicate, was struggling to breathe. Emily's heart dropped to her stomach as she rushed to her side, panic flooding her senses. "Mom, please," Emily whispered, her voice shaking. "Stay with me. I'm here." But her mother's breath was shallow and labored, and Emily could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another bad day. It was something worse. The fear she had been trying to suppress came rushing to the surface, and she felt a tidal wave of helplessness crash over her. Her mind raced. She needed to get her mom to the hospital. She needed help, but there was no time. She couldn't afford an ambulance. There was no one to call. The world felt like it was collapsing around her. It was in that moment of overwhelming despair that Emily remembered Keanu. She remembered his words, the calmness in his voice, the understanding in his eyes. He had told her she didn't have to go through everything alone. But how could she ask for help now? She barely knew him. She couldn't rely on someone who had only entered her life a few days ago. But as her mother's breathing grew more erratic, Emily realized there was no other choice. She quickly grabbed her phone, her hands trembling as she scrolled through. Her contacts. She could feel the panic clawing at her chest, but she forced herself to stay focused, and then she did something she never thought she would do. She called Keanu. The phone rang only once before he picked up. "Emily, what's wrong?" His voice was instantly concerned. I need help," she whispered, barely able to form the words. "My mom, she's not breathing right. I don't know what to do." There was a long pause, and for a moment, Emily thought the line had gone silent. But then Keanu's voice came through, steady and calm. "I'm on my way," he said. "Hang in there. I'll be there in a few minutes. Just stay with her." Emily couldn't believe it. She felt a wave of relief wash over her at the sound of his voice, but she also felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. She hadn't wanted to call him. She hadn't wanted to rely on anyone. But here he was without hesitation, ready to help her. When Keanu arrived, Emily was beside her mother, holding her hand and trying to keep her calm. She looked up as he walked through the door, his face a mask of determination and concern. Without saying a word, he moved quickly to her mother's side, kneeling down and taking over with an ease that surprised Emily. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions. He just acted. He knew exactly what to do. He checked her mother's vitals, instructed Emily to get her things together for a hospital visit, and made sure Emily was calm and collected. Keanu didn't just show up. He became her rock in that moment. As they waited for the ambulance, Emily stood by her mother's side, her hand gripping hers tightly. The overwhelming emotions of the past few weeks, fear, exhaustion, frustration, suddenly seemed to fade into the background. For the first time in a long time, Emily wasn't alone. She didn't have to carry the weight of the world on her shoulders by herself. And in that moment, with Keanu by her side, Emily realized something she hadn't allowed herself to feel before. It was okay to lean on someone else. It was okay to need help. The ambulance finally arrived, and as they drove to the hospital, Emily looked over at Keanu. He sat beside her, quiet but present, his presence offering her a sense of peace she hadn't known she needed. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but for the first time in a long time she had hope. The hospital was a blur of flashing lights, hurried footsteps, and medical jargon. Emily barely registered the passing hours as she sat by her mother's side, holding her hand and whispering words of comfort. The doctors had acted quickly, and they were able to stabilize her mom. But it was clear that this wasn't a temporary setback. Emily's worst fear had been realized. Her mom's condition was worsening, and the path ahead was uncertain. But there, in the sterile, fluorescent-lit room, something inside Emily began to shift. She had spent so long trying to keep everything together, burying her emotions beneath a veneer of strength, that she hadn't allowed herself the space to feel, to breathe, to be human. Now, surrounded by the quiet beeping of machines and the hum of hospital life, Emily felt the weight of everything. But for the first time in a long time, she wasn't holding it all alone. Keanu hadn't left her side since they arrived at the hospital. After ensuring her mother was settled into a room, he had quietly taken a seat by Emily, giving her space but never straying too far. His presence, steady and unspoken, was the anchor she hadn't known she needed. He hadn't asked for anything in return. He was simply there, providing the kind of support that Emily had never allowed herself to accept. As the hours passed, Emily found herself reflecting on everything that had led her to this point. The fear, the exhaustion, the unrelenting sense of being alone. She had always thought that strength meant doing everything on her own, that to ask for help was a sign of weakness. But now, with Keanu there, she realized how wrong she had been. Strength didn't come from doing everything alone. It came from being vulnerable, from allowing others to help when you needed it most. It came from knowing that no one was truly meant to carry the world on their shoulders by themselves. Keanu's words echoed in her mind. It's okay to let someone in. It's okay to not have all the answers. She had been so afraid of needing others, of exposing her weaknesses. But now, looking at the way Keanu had stepped in without hesitation, without expecting anything in return, she saw the truth. Real Strength came from the willingness to lean on those who cared and to allow yourself to be vulnerable, to let others in. As the sun began to rise, Emily realized how much she had changed in just a few days. She was no longer the person who thought she had to face everything alone. She had opened herself up to the possibility of connection, of support, and in doing so, she had found the courage to keep going. Keanu turned to her as she sat by her mother's bed, his expression kind but quiet. He hadn't asked for anything, but Emily knew he had given her a gift, something she could never repay. "I don't know what to say," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You've done more for me than I could ever thank you for." Keanu smiled softly, a hint of warmth in his eyes. "You don't need to thank me, Emily. I'm just glad I could be there when you needed someone." And just like that, Emily knew she wasn't alone anymore. She wasn't alone in the struggle, in the pain, or in the uncertainty of what the future held. She had Keanu, someone who had come into her life at the right moment, someone who had reminded her of the power of compassion, of human connection. As the day went on, Emily found herself more at peace than she had been in a long time. She still didn't know what would happen next, whether her mother would get better or worse, but she knew that no matter what, she would no longer face it in isolation. She had the strength to face whatever came, not because she was alone, but because she had others to lean on, and that realization brought with it an unexpected sense of peace. The fear that had once consumed her faded into the background, replaced by a quiet certainty that no matter how difficult things got, there was always hope. Sometimes that hope came from unexpected places, from strangers who turned into something more. And that, Emily knew, was the kind of love and support that could change everything. As she sat in the quiet room, the weight of the world seemed a little less heavy. With Keanu beside her and the promise of support, Emily found herself believing in a future that was still filled with possibility. And for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to imagine a world where she didn't have to carry everything on her own. Weeks passed, and the initial panic surrounding her mother's health began to settle into a new normal. Her mum was still sick, but with Keanu's help and the doctor's care, Emily found herself slowly regaining some semblance of balance. The routine of work, visits to the hospital, and caring for her mum became something she could handle, barely, but enough. And with each passing day, she realized that she was no longer alone in this fight. Keanu didn't just offer his help when things were at their worst. He continued to check in on her, ensuring that she was okay, offering support without expecting anything in return. It was during one of these visits to the hospital that Emily found herself standing in the waiting room, staring out the window. The sky was painted with the soft hues of a setting sun, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she allowed herself to think about something other than the next crisis. What if there was a way for her to move forward, to find a new chapter, one where she didn't feel as if she was just surviving? The question lingered in the air, unresolved, until Keanu appeared in the doorway, his presence as comforting as always. "Hey," he greeted softly, giving her a small smile. Emily turned to face him, her heart lifting slightly at the sight of him. "Hey, I brought you some coffee," he said, holding up a cup, a small but thoughtful gesture that brought a warmth to her chest. She took the cup from him gratefully. "Thanks," she murmured, sipping it, feeling the warmth seep into her bones. Keanu leaned against the doorframe, his gaze thoughtful. "How's your mom doing?" Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. "She's stable, but I can see it in her eyes. She's tired. We're all tired." Keanu nodded. "I can imagine." He paused, glancing out the window where the city sprawled beneath the fading light. "You've been through a lot, Emily." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Emily felt something stir inside her, something she hadn't allowed herself to feel until now. It wasn't just the exhaustion that had been weighing on her. It was something deeper, something she hadn't realized she'd been avoiding, a longing for change. "I never thought it would be like this," Emily said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I would be able to handle everything on my own. I didn't want anyone to see me struggling, to see how weak I really am." Keanu stepped closer, his expression sincere. "You're not weak, Emily. You're just human, and even the strongest. People need help sometimes." She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of judgment, but all she saw was understanding. "I don't even know where to begin," she admitted. "It's like I've been stuck in this endless cycle of just trying to survive. But I want more than that. I want to live again. I want to believe that there's something more out there for me." Keanu's eyes softened. "You can live again. It's not about having everything figured out. It's about taking one step at a time and allowing yourself to move forward." His words hit her harder than she expected. She realized how much she had been holding on to, how tightly she had clung to the idea of control, of managing everything by herself. But in doing so, she had denied herself the possibility of growth, of change. "I don't know if I'm ready for that," Emily said, her voice shaky. "What if I mess up? What if I fail?" Keanu gave a quiet chuckle, but it wasn't mocking, it was warm, gentle. "Failure is part of the journey. It's not about getting everything right. It's about trying, about moving forward even when you're scared, and you don't have to do it alone." The sincerity in his voice made Emily pause, and for the first time she felt the burden she had carried for so long begin to lift. She had spent so much time believing that she wasn't allowed to ask for help, that she had to face the world alone. But Keanu's unwavering support, his belief in her, was beginning to show her a different way. Maybe it was time to stop pretending she had it all together. Maybe it was time to take the next step, not just for her mum, but for herself. "I don't know what the future holds," she murmured, her voice filled with uncertainty. "But maybe it's time for me to start thinking about it." Keanu smiled, a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "That's the first step. You don't need to know everything right away, but allowing yourself to hope again, that's what matters." In the silence that followed, Emily felt a shift deep inside her. The fear that had held her back for so long didn't completely disappear, but it didn't control her anymore. She had allowed herself to see that there was hope, that there were possibilities beyond the daily grind of survival. As Keanu stood beside her, his quiet support wrapping around her like a blanket, Emily realized something. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about living, about choosing to step into the unknown, even when the future felt uncertain. And with that realization, a tiny spark of hope ignited within her. The following weeks were a whirlwind of change for Emily. Her mother's condition remained stable but fragile, and Emily had taken on the challenge of balancing her time between the hospital, work, and caring for her mom. But despite the emotional weight of her responsibilities, she felt lighter, different somehow. Keanu's presence in her life had done more than she realized. He had given her the space to breathe, to reflect on her own desires and needs, and to confront the fears that had held her captive for so long. He had shown her that it was okay to ask for help, that it was okay to lean on others, and that life wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. One evening, as Emily walked out of the hospital after a long day, she felt a rare sense of calm. It wasn't the absence of worry, but a quiet acceptance of the present moment. She had stopped trying to control everything, stopped pretending that she had all the answers. And in doing so, she had allowed herself to live, not just survive. She made her way to the coffee shop, a small ritual she had held on to over the past few months. It was her space to decompress, to escape the weight of the world, even if only for a little while. As she walked in, the familiar smell of roasted coffee beans and pastries greeted her, wrapping her in comfort. And there he was, Keanu, seated at their usual table by the window, a book in hand, looking as relaxed as she had ever seen him. When he saw her, he stood up with a warm smile. "Hey you," he said, his voice soft with familiarity. "How's everything?" Emily sat down across from him, a sigh escaping her lips. "It's been a day," she said, but there was no hint of despair in her tone. Just a quiet acknowledgement that life was difficult, but she was handling it. "I get it," Keanu said, his eyes kind. "You're juggling a lot." She smiled a little, grateful for the understanding. "Yeah, but I'm not as overwhelmed as I used to be. It's different now. I think I'm finally starting to accept that I can't control everything." Keanu raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean? I mean, for the longest time I thought I had to do it all on my own. I thought I had to have everything figured out and I couldn't afford to be weak. But now I see things differently. I see that it's okay to ask for help, and it's okay to have moments where things aren't perfect. Keanu's gaze softened, and he leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. That's a big shift, Emily. I'm proud of you. The words meant more to her than she could explain. She had always prided herself on her independence, her ability to handle anything that came her way. But somewhere along the way, she had lost sight of what it meant to truly live, to embrace the ups and downs, the imperfections, and the connections that made life meaningful. Thank you for everything, she said quietly, meeting his gaze. For being there when I needed it most. I don't know how I would have gotten through this without you. Keanu smiled, a soft, genuine expression that made her heart swell. I would have gotten through it, Emily. You're stronger than you think. But I'm glad I could be here with you. The conversation shifted then away from the past few months, and they found themselves talking about everything and nothing, about books they were reading, movies they loved, and places they dreamed of visiting. It was the kind of conversation Emily hadn't allowed herself to have in a long time, a conversation that didn't revolve around survival, but around living. And as they laughed and talked, she realized that something had changed between them. What started as an unexpected encounter had grown into something deeper, something more meaningful. It was no longer just about two people helping each other through difficult times. It was about two people who had found solace and comfort in each other's presence. As the night grew darker and the coffee shop began to empty, Emily found herself feeling at peace. The world still had its challenges, but she was no longer defined by them. She had come to understand that life was about balance, finding joy even in the difficult moments, allowing yourself to lean on others, and most importantly, giving yourself permission to hope for a better future. Keanu stood up as they both prepared to leave, and for a moment there was a silence between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that spoke volumes. I don't know what the future holds, Emily said softly, her voice almost a whisper. Keanu turned to her, his expression steady and kind. Neither do I. But whatever happens, we'll face it, together. The words hung in the air, an unspoken promise of something more, a future built not on perfection, but on the willingness to face life's challenges side by side. As Emily stepped out into the night, her heart felt lighter than it had in weeks. She didn't know exactly where the road ahead would take her, but for the first time in a long time, she was ready to walk it, one step at a time, with hope in her heart and the support of those she had come to trust. It had been months since Emily had allowed herself to embrace the unknown. Since the hospital, since the long nights where she lay awake thinking about all that had happened, she had found peace in ways she never imagined possible. Her mother's condition remained stable, though the road to recovery was still long and uncertain. But that wasn't the center of Emily's world anymore. It was just one piece of the larger puzzle, a part of the bigger picture that was unfolding in ways she never expected. Emily had always been someone who needed control. She thrived on knowing what would happen next, on being prepared for every curveball life might throw her way. But somewhere along the way she realized that life wasn't something to be controlled, it was something to be lived, and living meant accepting the unknown. It meant giving yourself the space to grow, to change, and to hope. As she sat at her desk one morning, watching the sunlight filter through the office windows, Emily reflected on all that had happened. Her life had shifted in ways she couldn't have predicted when she first met Keanu. He had come into her life like a quiet force, offering support and kindness when she needed it most. And in return, he had shown her what it meant to live authentically, to let go of the expectations she had placed on herself, to trust in the moments and people around her. And now, she found herself sitting here, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of possibility. A few months ago, she couldn't imagine moving forward, but now she saw the future stretching out before her, a future filled with both uncertainty and excitement. She didn't have all the answers, but that was okay. She didn't need them. Keanu had been right all along. It wasn't about having everything figured out. It was about taking the next step, even if you couldn't see the whole staircase. It was about trusting that each moment, each choice, brought her closer to where she was meant to be. Morning. Keanu's voice broke into her thoughts as he stepped into the office, holding 2 cups of coffee. Morning, Emily smiled, her heart lifting at the sight of him. I thought you could use this, he said, handing her the cup. She took it gratefully, her fingers brushing against his for a brief moment. Thanks, she said, settling into her chair. How's everything going with the new project? Keanu shrugged, a playful glint in his eye. It's going, slowly but surely, but that's how things go sometimes, right? Emily nodded, feeling a warmth spread through her chest. It had been months since that night in the coffee shop, the night where she had first begun to understand the true meaning of hope. Since then, they had spent countless hours talking, laughing, and supporting each other through the highs and lows. There was a comfort in his presence that she had never experienced before, and it had slowly blossomed into something deeper. Something real. I've been thinking, Emily said, her voice thoughtful, about all of it, the past few months, the changes, everything, and I think I'm finally ready for the next step. Keanu raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What do you mean? I mean, I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything, trying to fix it all. But I can't keep doing that. I want to be someone who lives, who doesn't just survive, but actually embraces the journey, whatever it looks like. Keanu's eyes softened and he leaned forward slightly. That's a huge realization, Emily, and I'm proud of you. Emily smiled, the weight in her chest feeling lighter than it ever had before. I couldn't have done it without you. You've been here through it all, helping me find the strength I didn't even know I had. I'm really grateful. Keanu smiled back, his expression warm. You had that strength all along. I'm just glad I could remind you of it. The words lingered between them, a gentle affirmation of all they had been through and all they had come to realize. It was more than just a friendship. It was a bond that had grown from shared struggles, from moments of vulnerability, and from the willingness to face the unknown together. As Emily sat there, savoring the quiet comfort of Keanu's presence, she realized how far she had come. She had let go of the need to have all the answers, and in doing so, she had found the courage to start a new chapter. She didn't know what the future would bring, but for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of it, because she wasn't facing it alone. Whatever happens next, we'll face it together, Keanu said quietly, as though reading her thoughts. Emily nodded, her heart swelling with gratitude. Yeah, we will. And as they sat together, sharing a simple moment of peace, Emily knew that the future wasn't something to fear. It was something to embrace. Whatever challenges came her way, she would face them with hope, with strength, and with the knowledge that she didn't have to carry the weight alone. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear. It was a road that she was ready to walk, and that was enough.